She had been carrying his child while enduring morning sickness and swollen ankles, sacrificing her body and freedom for the promise of family, and this was how he repaid her. Madeline Pierce stood frozen at the center of Edward's charity gala, expensive chocolate cake sliding down her emerald maternity dress in thick, viscous streaks. The gasps of the wealthy attendees crashed against her ears like breaking glass. 500 pairs of eyes fixed on her, their collective horror shifting into uncomfortable laughter that pricked her skin like tiny needles. The young woman who'd thrown it, Vanessa, a stranger to Madeline until 30 seconds ago, stood defiantly nearby, her red-painted lips curled in satisfaction. But it was Edward's reaction that truly gutted her. Her billionaire husband, the father of her unborn child, merely watched with an amused smirk playing at the corners of his lips, making no move to defend his humiliated wife. What kind of man would stand by while his pregnant wife was publicly degraded? The kind who had secrets, the kind who had something to hide. And as the cake dripped onto the marble floor, something inside Madeline hardened into resolve. This humiliation wasn't random. Nothing in Edward Pierce's world ever was. "Someone get this poor woman cleaned up," Edward finally said, his voice carrying the practiced concern that never quite reached his eyes. He made no move to approach her himself. A flurry of staff appeared with towels and sympathetic expressions. As they led Madeline away, she caught Vanessa's eye for just a moment. Something passed between them. A flicker, a message, a confirmation. Madeline's hand instinctively went to her belly, the prosthetic attachment that had become almost a part of her now. Inside her clenched palm, she could feel the hard edges of the key that had been slipped to her in the chaos, pressing into her flesh like a promise. In the privacy of the powder room, Madeline locked the door and leaned heavily against it. Her reflection stared back at her from the gold-framed mirror. Chocolate-spattered dress, perfectly styled hair now hanging limply around her face, eyes burning with an intensity that would frighten anyone who looked too closely. She opened her palm and examined the small key with the storage unit number etched into its surface. "Claire," she whispered to her reflection, to the ghost of her sister who haunted her every move in this house. "I'm almost there." Before we dive deep into this heartfelt story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free, as your support helps us create more meaningful stories for you. Enjoy the story. 6 months earlier. The auction house buzzed with the quiet energy of extreme wealth. Madeline Davis stood in the corner, watching rather than participating, her trained eye assessing each piece that came to the block, identifying the genuine masterpieces from the merely expensive. As an art authenticator, she'd spent years learning to spot the truth beneath layers of deception. "The Durain is stunning, isn't it?" A deep voice beside her made Madeline start. The way he captures light, almost painful in its beauty. She turned to find herself looking into eyes so intensely blue they seemed artificial. The man was tall, his bespoke suit fitting him like armor, silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. She recognized him immediately. Edward Pierce, billionaire collector, recently widowed, famously reclusive. "Actually," Madeline said, "I was just thinking it's a particularly skilled forgery." Edward Pierce's eyebrows rose slightly. Most people would have backed down, afraid to contradict someone of his stature. Madeline wasn't most people. The brushwork in the lower left corner shows hesitation that Durain never displayed, and the pigments don't quite match his palette from that period. She smiled thinly. "But it's excellent work. Someone went to extraordinary lengths." For a moment, Edward's face hardened, a flash of something cold and calculating crossing his features before warming into admiration. "That's a bold statement. I was considering bidding on it." "Then I just saved you several $1,000,000. He laughed, the sound drawing glances from nearby attendees. "You're Madeline Davis." It wasn't a question. "Your reputation precedes you." A chill ran down her spine. She'd been careful to keep a low profile, to enter the auction house without drawing attention. Yet he knew her name, recognized her face. She forced her expression to remain neutral. "And you're Edward Pierce. Your reputation fills entire rooms before you even enter them." He smiled again, this time with genuine pleasure. "Have dinner with me." "I don't mix business with pleasure, Mr. Pierce." "But I haven't offered you business yet." His eyes flickered down to her hands, her unadorned ring finger. "Just dinner." Madeline knew she should decline. Everything in her screamed caution, but the photo of Claire that she kept in her wallet, the one taken just weeks before her accidental drowning, burned in her mind. Claire with her tentative smile, the bruises she'd tried to hide with makeup, the fear in her eyes that no camera could quite capture. Claire, who had married Edward Pierce and never lived to tell about it. "One dinner," Madeline agreed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "That's all." Edward's smile widened, revealing perfect teeth. "One dinner is all it takes to change a life, Miss Davis." How right he was, though not in the way he imagined. That night, in her small apartment filled with books on art history and forgery techniques, Madeline stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. With trembling hands, she lifted the scissors and began to cut her auburn hair, watching the long strands fall into the sink. She dyed what remained a honey blonde, just like Claire's. The transformation wouldn't be enough on its own. They weren't identical. But the resemblance, carefully enhanced, would be enough to catch Edward's attention, to make him see ghosts. "I'm coming for you," she whispered to her new reflection, a reflection designed to remind Edward Pierce of the wife he'd murdered. "Whatever it takes." She didn't sleep that night, rehearsing instead the details of her fabricated life, the careful inconsistencies in her background that would intrigue rather than alarm him. By morning, Madeline Davis was fading, and in her place stood a woman with a mission, a woman willing to walk into the lion's den armed with nothing but her wits and an unquenchable thirst for justice. Their dinner was at his private club, a place where the waiters moved like shadows, and the other diners pretended not to notice the infamous Edward Pierce with a woman who bore an unsettling resemblance to his late wife. "You've changed your hair," he remarked, studying her over the rim of his whiskey glass. "I needed a change," she replied simply. "Do you like it?" His eyes darkened. "It suits you." Throughout dinner, she caught him staring at her, a strange hunger in his expression that had nothing to do with the exquisite food before them. Once, when she laughed at something he said, he went completely still, his face draining of color. "I'm sorry," she said, touching his hand lightly. "Did I say something wrong?" Edward shook his head, recovering quickly. "Not at all. You just reminded me of someone for a moment." "Your wife?" Madeline asked, allowing vulnerability to show in her expression. "I read about what happened. I'm so sorry for your loss." His jaw tightened. Claire was unique, irreplaceable. "And yet, here we are," Madeline said softly, the challenge in her words masked by gentle delivery. Edward studied her for a long moment, then smiled slowly. "Yes, here we are." Their courtship was a whirlwind, just as she'd planned. Edward sent rare flowers to her apartment daily. He took her to gallery openings in Paris and Rome. He introduced her to his circle of elegant, hollow-eyed friends who looked at her with barely concealed shock at her resemblance to Claire. Through it all, Madeline played her part, intelligent enough to interest him, vulnerable enough to need him, beautiful enough to tempt him, and always with that hint of Claire that both haunted and enthralled him. 2 months after their first meeting, Edward proposed on his yacht in the Mediterranean. As he slipped the enormous diamond onto her finger, the same finger that had once worn Claire's ring, Madeline felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the gentle rocking of the boat. "I never thought I'd find love again," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion that Madeline had learned to recognize as performance rather than truth. "You've brought light back into my life." She forced tears into her eyes. "I'll never leave you," she promised, the lie bitter on her tongue. In the privacy of her cabin that night, while Edward slept in his separate quarters, always the gentleman, always maintaining appearances, Madeline pressed her fist against her mouth to silence her sobs. The weight of what she was doing, the danger she was courting, pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. But whenever her resolve wavered, she thought of Claire's journals, discovered through months of painstaking investigation, detailing her growing fear of her husband. Claire, who had suspected something sinister in Edward's business dealings. Claire, who had threatened to go to the authorities. Claire, who had drowned in their pool despite being an experienced swimmer. "Just a little longer," Madeline whispered to herself, to Claire's ghost, "just until I have proof." They were married a month later in a private ceremony on Edward's estate. The society pages called it a romance for the ages. The grieving widower finding love again with a woman who appreciated his passion for art. No one questioned the speed of their courtship, or the uncanny resemblance Madeline bore to the deceased Claire. No one except Detective Alexandra Rivera, who watched the wedding announcement with narrowed eyes and a growing suspicion, reaching for the file on Claire Pierce's death that had never quite felt closed. 3 months into their marriage, Madeline sat at her vanity, carefully applying the makeup that would give her skin the sallow tinge of early pregnancy. The bathroom door was locked, Edward still asleep in their massive 4-poster bed. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she dabbed yellow-green concealer beneath her eyes and across her cheeks. From the cabinet beneath the sink, she retrieved the smallest of her prosthetic bellies, hardly more than a slight curve, but enough to plant the seed. "Morning sickness is the worst," she would tell Edward over breakfast, pushing away the coffee she pretended to suddenly find revolting. Her body would convulse with perfectly timed heaves as she rushed to the bathroom, leaving the door slightly ajar so he could hear her retching. Actually, just water she'd discreetly taken in her mouth before the performance. When she emerged, her face carefully constructed into exhausted joy, Edward would be waiting, his eyes wide with something that might have been wonder, might have been calculation. "Could you be?" he asked that first morning, hope and disbelief mingling in his voice. Madeline placed a trembling hand over her stomach. "I think so. I've been feeling strange for weeks now." Edward crossed the room in 3 long strides, gathering her into an embrace that felt both possessive and distant. "A child," he whispered into her hair. "Our child." She felt his hand press against her abdomen, gentle now, but containing a latent strength that made her skin crawl beneath her silk robe. This man had held Claire with these same hands, had perhaps pressed them against her sister's throat, or held her under the water until bubbles stopped breaking the surface of their Olympic-sized pool. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything," Madeline whispered, hating the intimacy of this moment, this shared lie. Later that day, she made a show of scheduling an appointment with Dr. Sophia Rivera, supposedly an obstetrician at the city's most exclusive women's clinic, actually Detective Alexandra Rivera's sister, a general practitioner who had agreed to help with the charade. The fabricated medical records would be impeccable. Edward insisted on accompanying her to the first appointment, of course. He sat in the waiting room while Madeline was examined, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair, his eyes tracking every movement in the clinic with the wariness of a predator in unfamiliar territory. "Everything looks perfect, Doctor," Rivera announced when they were reunited in her office, the sonogram images, carefully edited from another patient's actual pregnancy, displayed on her computer screen. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Pierce." Edward stared at the grainy image, at the tiny bean-shaped smudge that was supposedly his child. Something flickered in his eyes, not just pride or joy, but a kind of satisfaction that turned Madeline's actual stomach. This baby represented something to him beyond family. It represented legacy, continuation, perhaps even redemption. "I want to announce it at the charity gala next month," he said on the drive home, his hand resting possessively on her thigh. once you're safely through the first trimester. Madeline covered his hand with hers, forcing herself not to flinch at his touch. Whatever you think is best, darling. That night, while Edward worked late in his study, Madeline explored the vast mansion that was now her prison and her battleground. Most of the West Wing remained mysteriously locked, Edward claiming it housed valuable art that required specific climate controls. But Madeline had noticed the security cameras that tracked her movements, the way certain staff members seemed to report her activities to Edward. She was being watched, assessed, her leash measured. In her bathroom, safely behind locked doors, she pulled out her burner phone, hidden inside a tampon applicator in a box Edward would never touch, and texted Detective Rivera. Making progress. He's completely invested in the pregnancy. Need access to West Wing. The response came minutes later. Patience. Stick to the timeline. Building the case. Patience. Madeline almost laughed. How much patience had Claire had waiting for someone to believe her fears? How patient had Claire been as water filled her lungs? As the weeks passed, Madeline graduated to larger prosthetics, each carefully crafted to mimic the progression of pregnancy. She researched endlessly, learning the minutiae of each trimester, how her body should change, what discomforts to report, what cravings to affect. The anxiety of discovery was constant, a low-grade fever that never quite broke. Every morning she woke wondering if today would be the day Edward noticed a flaw in her performance, the day her mask slipped. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years studying forgeries, learning to detect the tiny inconsistencies that revealed deception. Now she herself was the forgery, presenting as authentic something that didn't exist. One night, unable to sleep beside the man she'd married, Madeline slipped from their bed and wandered the darkened hallways of the mansion. The security system had a 3-minute blind spot during its nightly reset, information that had cost Detective Rivera considerable effort to obtain. It wasn't enough time to search thoroughly, but enough to try the doors of the West Wing, to see what might be accessible. The first 2 doors were locked as expected. The third, a nondescript panel at the end of the corridor, opened silently to her touch. Heart hammering, Madeline slipped inside, pulling the small penlight from the pocket of her robe. The narrow beam revealed a room frozen in time. Claire's room, not their marital bedroom, but a private space that had clearly been hers alone. A vanity with perfume bottles arranged in perfect order, clothes still hanging in the closet, shoes lined up precisely beneath them, books stacked on the nightstand, and on the desk by the window, a leather-bound journal. Madeline's hands trembled as she approached, aware of each precious second ticking away. She couldn't take the journal, its absence would be noticed, but she could photograph pages. Working frantically, she snapped image after image with her burner phone, the flash momentarily illuminating Claire's private thoughts, her growing suspicions, her increasing fear. Edward brought home another acquisition today. One entry read, "Something's not right about the provenance." When I questioned him, he became cold, distant. Later, I found him in my bathroom, going through my medications. Why would he do that? Another, dated just weeks before her death. I found discrepancies in 3 more pieces. These aren't simple mistakes in documentation. Someone is deliberately falsifying histories. I think Edward is knowingly selling forgeries through the gallery. When I confronted him, The rest of the page was torn out. The sound of footsteps in the hallway sent ice through Madeline's veins. She quickly replaced the journal, killed her light, and pressed herself against the wall beside the door. The knob turned slowly, the door opening just enough for someone to peer inside. After an eternity, the door closed again, the footsteps receding. Madeline waited 5 full minutes before daring to exit, her nightgown damp with cold sweat despite the controlled temperature of the mansion. As she crept back to the bedroom she shared with Edward, one thought burned in her mind. Claire had known. She'd discovered Edward's fraud operation and paid with her life. Now, more than ever, Madeline needed to maintain her performance. The child that never was had become her shield, her excuse, her weapon. Each time Edward placed his hand on her growing belly, each time he spoke of their future together, she silently promised Claire that justice was coming. She just needed more time, more evidence, more courage. "Where were you?" Edward asked when she slipped back into bed, his voice thick with sleep, or perhaps pretended sleep. "Just getting some water," she lied, curling away from him. The baby was kicking. His hand came to rest on her hip, heavy and warm. "My son," he murmured. "Or daughter," Madeline corrected, as she always did, playing the role of the modern, equality-minded wife. Edward's fingers tightened slightly. "A son," he repeated. "It has to be a son." The first real crisis came when Edward's mother announced her intention to visit. Evelyn Pierce, a razor-thin woman with eyes like flint and a smile that never reached them, arrived unannounced one rainy Tuesday, sweeping into the mansion with an entourage of staff and Louis Vuitton luggage. "I had to see for myself," she declared, her critical gaze raking over Madeline's 5-month bump, covered by an elegant maternity dress, after Claire's disappointments. Madeline froze, the teacup halfway to her lips. "Disappointments?" Edward's hand clamped around her wrist, hard enough to hurt. "Mother," he warned, his voice low. Evelyn waved a bejeweled hand dismissively. "Water under the bridge. Claire lost 2 pregnancies before her accident. Edward was devastated, of course. A man needs heirs." Her smile was tight, predatory. "But you seem to be succeeding where she failed." The revelation hit Madeline like a physical blow. Claire had been pregnant, twice, and lost the babies. Or had she? Had those pregnancies also ended under suspicious circumstances? The thought made the tea in her mouth turn to acid. "I'm taking excellent care of myself," Madeline managed, her free hand resting protectively over her prosthetic bump. "And the baby." "Mother will be staying for a month," Edward announced, his tone brooking no argument, "to help you prepare for the baby." A month, 4 weeks of constant scrutiny from a woman who had known Claire intimately, who might notice the discrepancies in Madeline's performance. 4 weeks of limited privacy, of heightened risk. "How wonderful," Madeline lied, her cheeks aching with the effort of her smile. That night she texted Detective Rivera from inside the shower, the water running to mask any sound, steam fogging the surveillance cameras that Edward thought she didn't know about. Evelyn Pierce arrived, staying a month. Need to accelerate. The response was immediate. Too risky. Maintain cover. Use her presence to gather more info. Easier said than done. Evelyn shadowed Madeline throughout the mansion, offering unsolicited advice about childbirth and motherhood, reminiscing about Edward's childhood, and constantly, relentlessly comparing Madeline to Claire. "Claire was such a delicate thing," Evelyn remarked one afternoon as they took tea in the solarium. "So fragile. Not like you at all." Her eyes narrowed. "You have a resilience about you." "I've had to be resilient," Madeline replied carefully. "Life hasn't always been kind." Evelyn stirred her tea, the silver spoon clinking against fine bone china. "Edward was devastated after Claire, simply shattered. I've never seen a man grieve so deeply." She fixed Madeline with a penetrating stare. "It's remarkable how quickly he recovered upon meeting you." The accusation hung in the air between them. Madeline met the older woman's gaze steadily. "Sometimes the heart recognizes what it needs," she said softly. "I would never presume to replace Claire. She will always be his first love." Evelyn's mouth tightened. "Yes, she will." That evening, as Madeline prepared for another charity function, her prosthetic belly now requiring careful concealment beneath flowing gowns, Evelyn appeared in her dressing room doorway. I have something for you, she said, holding out a small velvet box. It belonged to Claire. Edward would want you to have it now. Inside the box lay a delicate gold necklace with a small diamond pendant. With trembling fingers, Madeline lifted it, the stone catching the light. "It's beautiful," she whispered, genuine emotion tightening her throat. Had this been Claire's? Had her sister worn this same necklace, touched this same gold? Edward gave it to her when she told him about their first pregnancy, Evelyn said, watching Madeline's reaction closely. She was wearing it the day she died. The necklace suddenly felt like it was burning Madeline's fingers. Claire had been wearing this when she drowned. Or when she was drowned. This delicate chain had been around her neck as water filled her lungs. "I can't accept this," Madeline said, trying to return the box. Evelyn closed Madeline's fingers around it. "Oh, but I insist. Edward would be so pleased." Her smile was a cold, knowing thing. "Unless there's some reason you'd rather not wear something of Claire's." It was a test, a trap. Refusal would arouse suspicion. Acceptance meant wearing a reminder of Claire's fate around her own neck. "I'd be honored," Madeline said, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. She turned, presenting her back to Evelyn. "Would you help me with the clasp?" The cold metal settled against her skin as Evelyn secured the necklace, her fingers lingering uncomfortably against Madeline's neck for a moment too long. "Perfect," Evelyn murmured. "Now you truly are taking her place." The words sent a chill down Madeline's spine that had nothing to do with the mansion's air conditioning. That night at the charity function, Edward couldn't take his eyes off the necklace, his gaze repeatedly dropping to where it rested against Madeline's collarbone. "You look beautiful," he said, but she knew it wasn't her he was seeing. It was during Evelyn's third week at the mansion that disaster nearly struck. Madeline woke in the middle of the night with actual, genuine illness. Food poisoning from the oysters served at dinner, which she'd eaten to maintain her cover despite knowing the risks to pregnant women. As she huddled miserably in the bathroom, her body purging itself violently, the door opened to reveal Evelyn in a silk robe, her face a mask of concern that didn't reach her calculating eyes. "You poor dear," she cooed, approaching to hold back Madeline's hair. "Let me help." Madeline's blood ran cold despite her fever. Her prosthetic belly was secure, designed to withstand even intimate contact, but Evelyn's hands were dangerously close and, in her weakened state, Madeline wasn't sure she could fend off any determined investigation. "Please," she gasped between heaves, "get Edward." "He's sleeping so soundly," Evelyn replied, her hand now rubbing circles on Madeline's back, inching lower with each pass. "I hate to wake him. Let's get you cleaned up first." Madeline's mind raced. If Evelyn helped her undress, if she insisted on running a bath as she was suggesting now, discovery would be inevitable. In desperation, Madeline lurched to her feet, deliberately stumbling against the bathroom counter. I think I need to go to the hospital," she gasped. "Something's wrong with the baby." Panic flared in Evelyn's eyes. Not concern for Madeline, but fear of Edward's reaction if something happened to his heir on her watch. "I'll wake Edward immediately," she said, hurrying from the room. The crisis bought Madeline time, but it also meant a hospital visit that couldn't be faked or avoided. Dr. Rivera was hastily contacted, arrangements made for her to be the receiving physician, but the hours Madeline spent in the emergency room were some of the most terrifying of her life. One wrong move, one curious nurse, one unexpected examination, and her entire charade would collapse. In the end, it was Detective Rivera herself who saved the situation, posing as a hospital administrator and ensuring that Madeline's privacy was respected due to her high-profile status. The diagnosis of food poisoning was genuine. The assurances that the baby was unharmed were not. "That was too close," Detective Rivera murmured as she escorted Madeline to the hospital room where Edward waited. "We're running out of time." "I need access to his study," Madeline whispered back. "The evidence we need is there. I can feel it." "The charity gala next week," Rivera replied, her voice barely audible. "That's our window. Vanessa will create a distraction." "Vanessa?" "My partner. You'll know her when you see her." Rivera's hand tightened on Madeline's arm. "Be careful. Evelyn suspects something." Before Madeline could respond, they turned the corner to find Edward pacing the private hospital room, his face a mask of concern that might have been convincing if Madeline hadn't learned to read the calculation behind his expressions. "My darling," he exclaimed, rushing to envelop her in an embrace that felt more like possession than affection. "I've been frantic." Over his shoulder, Madeline met Detective Rivera's eyes. The countdown had begun. Evelyn departed 2 days later, called away by an emergency at her estate in the Hamptons, an emergency manufactured by Detective Rivera's team to remove one complication from an already precarious situation. Her parting words to Madeline were delivered with a smile like a paper cut. "Take care of my grandchild," she said, her hand resting briefly on Madeline's bump. "And yourself, of course. This family has seen enough tragedy." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. As Edward escorted his mother to her waiting car, Madeline stood in the doorway, one hand protectively covering her fake pregnancy, the other clutching Claire's necklace like a talisman. "Soon," she promised silently. "Soon, this will all be over." The days leading up to the charity gala passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Edward grew more attentive, more possessive, as if sensing something was about to change. He insisted on accompanying Madeline to her prenatal appointments, on approving her gala gown, on keeping her close at all times. "You're the most precious thing in my life," he told her the night before the gala, his hand splayed across her prosthetic belly as they lay in bed. "You and our son." In the darkness, Madeline stared at the ceiling, counting the hours until she could end this charade, until she could deliver justice for Claire. "I know," she whispered, the lie bitter on her tongue. But did Edward Pierce, master of deception, recognize a fellow performer? As his breathing evened into sleep, his arm remained locked around her waist, a restraint disguised as an embrace. And in the shadows of their bedroom, Madeline could almost swear she saw Claire watching, waiting, her pale face a reflection of Madeline's own determination and fear. The night of the gala arrived with the weight of destiny. Madeline stood before her mirror, the emerald maternity gown flowing over her 6-month prosthetic, Claire's necklace glinting at her throat. Her hands trembled slightly as she applied her lipstick, the same shade Claire had favored according to the photographs Madeline had studied obsessively. "You look ravishing," Edward said from the doorway, his tuxedo impeccable, his eyes hungry as they traveled over her. "Every man there will envy me tonight." "And every woman will envy me," she replied with practiced adoration, though the thought of being envied for being Edward Pierce's wife made her stomach turn. The ballroom of the Pierce mansion had been transformed into a glittering wonderland for the charity event, ostensibly raising funds for children's art education, though Madeline suspected the real purpose was to showcase Edward's latest acquisitions and cement his reputation as a philanthropist. The irony wasn't lost on her, a man who built his fortune on fraud and possibly murder, presenting himself as a beacon of culture and generosity. As they made their entrance, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, conversations hushing momentarily before rising again in a wave of fascinated whispers. Madeline had grown accustomed to the stares, some pitying, some curious, some openly hostile from women who had set their sights on Edward after Claire's death. "Mrs. Pierce, you're absolutely glowing," gushed an older woman whose diamonds could have funded a small nation. "Pregnancy clearly agrees with you." "Thank you," Madeline said, one hand automatically cradling her fake bump. "We're very blessed." "Indeed," the woman agreed, her eyes flickering between Madeline and Edward. "And brave, after what happened with poor Claire's." "Darling, there's Senator Michaels," Edward interrupted smoothly, his hand tightening on Madeline's waist. "We must say hello." As he guided her through the crowd, Madeline scanned the room, looking for the woman Rivera had described, Vanessa, the detective's partner who would create the necessary distraction. So much depended on timing, on everything going according to plan. The evening progressed with excruciating slowness. Madeline played her part, the adoring, expectant wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who had brought joy back into Edward Pierce's life. All the while, she watched the crowd, waiting for a signal, a sign that it was time. It came as she stood alone near the champagne fountain, Edward momentarily engaged with business associates across the room. A stunning woman in a red dress approached, her dark hair swept up in an elegant chignon, her lips the same crimson as her gown. "Lovely event," the woman said, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, "though the art selection is questionable." She sipped her drink, her eyes meeting Madeline's with unmistakable intent. "Some pieces aren't what they appear to be, are they?" Vanessa. It had to be. "Beauty often hides flaws," Madeline replied carefully, the code phrase Rivera had given her. "And sometimes flaws create beauty," Vanessa countered, completing the exchange. She leaned closer, ostensibly to admire Claire's necklace. "Third-floor storage room, east wing. The key will come with the distraction. Be ready." Before Madeline could respond, Vanessa melted back into the crowd, her red dress a splash of color among the more subdued evening wear. Madeline's pulse quickened, adrenaline flooding her system. After months of deception, of constant fear and vigilance, the endgame was finally in motion. Edward returned to her side, his hand possessively claiming the small of her back. "Who was that?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Just a woman admiring the necklace," Madeline said, touching the diamond pendant. "I didn't catch her name." Edward's gaze followed the retreating figure in red. Something like recognition flickered across his face before he mastered it. "Stay close to me for the rest of the evening," he said, his voice hardening slightly. "Some of these art collectors can be overzealous in their acquisitions." Was it possible he recognized Vanessa? Had their careful planning already been compromised? Madeline felt cold sweat beading between her shoulder blades despite the perfectly regulated temperature of the ballroom. "Of course, darling," she agreed, slipping her arm through his. "I'm feeling a little tired anyway. The baby, you know." His expression softened immediately at the mention of the child, the fiction that had become her greatest protection and her heaviest burden. "Perhaps you should rest for a while," he suggested. "The speeches won't start for another hour." "I'm fine," Madeline insisted. "I want to be by your side." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of small talk and forced smiles. Madeline's awareness narrowed to a pinpoint focus, Edward's position relative to hers, Vanessa's movements through the crowd, the exits and entrances to the ballroom. When the moment came, she needed to be ready. It happened during a lull in the conversation, as the orchestra transitioned between pieces. Vanessa appeared at the edge of the crowd, a plate of chocolate cake in her hands, her red lips curved in a predatory smile. She moved with deliberate purpose toward Madeline and Edward, her gaze fixed on them with an intensity that drew attention from nearby guests. "Mr. Pierce," she called, her voice carrying just enough to turn heads. "I believe we've met before." Edward stiffened beside Madeline. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, miss." "You don't remember me?" Vanessa's smile widened, dangerous and beautiful. "How disappointing. I certainly remember you. Our night in Paris was unforgettable." A ripple of interest passed through the crowd. Edward's face remained impassive, but Madeline felt the tension radiating from him like heat. "You're confused," he said coldly. "Please excuse us." "Confused?" Vanessa laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. "Is that what you tell your wife? That all the other women are confused?" She turned to Madeline, her expression a perfect blend of pity and contempt. How far along are you, honey? 6 months? He was with me 3 months ago. Do the math. Before either of them could respond, Vanessa lunged forward, the plate of cake arcing through the air with theatrical precision. Time seemed to slow as Madeline watched chocolate frosting and rich, dense cake separate from the plate, flying toward her in a brown blur. The impact was cold and shocking against her chest, the expensive cake sliding down her emerald gown in thick rivulets. Gasps erupted from the crowd, followed by uncomfortable laughter and hurried whispers. Madeline stood frozen, cake dripping onto the marble floor as Vanessa's hand brushed against hers in the chaos, pressing something small and hard into her palm. The key. "You pathetic, deluded woman," Vanessa spat, her performance flawless. "He'll never change." Security converged on them, but Edward waved them back, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Get her out," he ordered, nodding toward Vanessa. "Discreetly." As 2 guards escorted the Mistress from the ballroom, Edward turned to Madeline, his expression now carefully concerned. Cake continued to drip from her dress, but all she could feel was the hard edges of the key pressing into her palm. "Someone get this poor woman cleaned up," he finally said, his voice carrying the practiced concern that never quite reached his eyes. He made no move to approach her himself. A flurry of staff appeared with towels and sympathetic expressions. As they led Madeline away, she caught Vanessa's eye for just a moment. Something passed between them. A flicker, a message, a confirmation. Madeline's hand instinctively went to her belly, the prosthetic attachment that had become almost a part of her now. In the privacy of the powder room, Madeline locked the door and leaned heavily against it. Her reflection stared back at her from the gold-framed mirror, chocolate-spattered dress, perfectly styled hair now hanging limply around her face, eyes burning with an intensity that would frighten anyone who looked too closely. She opened her palm and examined the small key with the storage unit number etched into its surface. "Claire," she whispered to her reflection, to the ghost of her sister who haunted her every move in this house, "I'm almost there." She had 15 minutes, 20 at most, before her absence would become suspicious. Staff would be sent to check on her, to offer assistance with the ruined gown. Edward himself might come, his concern a perfect mask for his controlling nature. Working quickly, Madeline cleaned the worst of the cake from her dress, enough to make it appear she'd made an effort, not enough to suggest she'd lingered unnecessarily. Then, slipping from the powder room, she made her way toward the east wing, every sense heightened, every shadow a potential witness to her betrayal. The third-floor storage room was tucked at the end of a rarely used corridor. Madeline inserted the key with trembling fingers, the lock turning with a soft click that seemed thunderous in the empty hallway. Inside, darkness greeted her, until her eyes adjusted to reveal rows of filing cabinets, shelves stacked with document boxes, and a small desk with a computer that hummed softly in sleep mode. This was it, Edward's private archive, the repository of his secrets. Guided by instinct and desperation, Madeline went directly to the filing cabinet labeled PR. Inside, alphabetical folders contained documents, photographs, correspondence. Her fingers flew through them until she found what she was looking for. Pierce. Claire. The file was thick with papers, medical records, financial documents, photographs. Madeline's throat tightened as she flipped through images of her sister. Claire at their wedding. Claire at gallery openings. Claire in the hospital, pale and drawn after losing her second pregnancy. But it was the last set of documents that stopped her cold. Detailed toxicology reports, private investigator findings, all suggesting what Madeline had suspected. Claire's miscarriages hadn't been natural. They'd been induced, poisoned by the man who claimed to want an heir more than anything. And her drowning. Another file contained photographs of the pool area, of Claire's body being removed, of Edward speaking with police. His expression, even in these unguarded moments, showed no grief, no shock, only calculation. Most damning of all were the letters from Claire's doctors questioning the unusual symptoms she'd experienced before each miscarriage, the preliminary inquiries that had been shut down by Edward's lawyers, the concerns that had never made it into the official investigation. With shaking hands, Madeline used her phone to photograph everything, working methodically despite the panic clawing at her chest. Time was running out. At any moment, Edward might realize she wasn't still in the powder room, might send someone to find her. The computer yielded even more evidence, emails between Edward and various art authenticators, including Claire, detailing the forgery operation. There were invoices for materials used by the forgers, correspondence with buyers who may or may not have known they were purchasing fakes, and, most incriminating of all, a spreadsheet tracking the forgeries against their genuine counterparts, calculating profit margins that ran into millions. Madeline forwarded everything to the secure email address Rivera had given her, her fingers flying over the keyboard. As she worked, a sound from the hallway made her freeze. Footsteps, approaching with measured precision. Heart hammering, she logged out of the computer, replaced the files, and looked desperately for somewhere to hide. The footsteps stopped outside the door. The handle turned slowly. In that moment of pure terror, Madeline did the only thing she could think of. She collapsed to the floor beside the desk, one hand clutching her prosthetic belly, her face contorted in a grimace of pain. The door opened to reveal Edward's security chief, Marcus, his imposing figure filling the doorway, his hand reaching inside his jacket where Madeline knew he carried a gun. "Mrs. Pierce," he said, surprise momentarily replacing suspicion. "What are you doing here?" "Thank God," Madeline gasped, channeling every acting skill she possessed. "Help me. Something's wrong with the baby. I was looking for somewhere quiet to sit down when the pain started." Marcus hesitated, torn between his training to be suspicious and his conditioning to respect Edward's pregnant wife. "This area is restricted, ma'am." "I know, I'm sorry," she moaned, doubling over for effect. "Please, help me back downstairs. I need a doctor." For one excruciating moment, Marcus studied her, his hard eyes narrowing with suspicion. Then training took over. Edward would be furious if anything happened to his heir under the security chief's watch. "Let me help you, ma'am," he said, holstering his weapon and moving to support her elbow. "I'll call for medical assistance immediately." Madeline allowed him to help her to her feet, maintaining her pained expression while internally calculating how much evidence she'd managed to collect. Had it been enough? Had the email gone through before Marcus appeared? "How did you get in here?" he asked as they moved slowly down the corridor, his tone casual but his grip on her arm firmer than necessary. "The door was unlocked," Madeline lied, knowing the key was still safely hidden in her palm. "I just needed somewhere quiet to rest." Marcus's silence spoke volumes. As they descended the grand staircase, returning to the public areas of the mansion, Madeline spotted Edward at the bottom, his face a mask of concern as he spoke with Dr. Rivera, summoned for the gala precisely for this contingency. "Madeline!" Edward rushed forward, taking her from Marcus with a proprietary grip. "What happened?" "I found her in the East Wing storage room, sir," Marcus reported before Madeline could speak. "She says she was experiencing pain." Edward's eyes flashed to Madeline's, something cold and calculating passing through them before they softened with performative worry. "The storage room. What were you doing there, my darling?" "I just needed somewhere quiet," Madeline gasped, clutching her belly. "After that awful scene, I was so upset. I couldn't face everyone staring." Dr. Rivera stepped forward, her professional demeanor perfect. "Let's get Mrs. Pierce somewhere private where I can examine her." Edward hesitated, his gaze lingering on Madeline's face as if searching for deception. "Of course, my study is closest." "No," Dr. Rivera said firmly. "She needs to lie down properly. The bedroom would be best." The conflict played across Edward's features, his need to know what Madeline had discovered battling with his desire to maintain appearances in front of his guests. Appearances won, as Madeline had known they would. Edward Pierce had built his entire existence on the foundation of how others perceived him. "Take care of her," he instructed Doctor. Rivera, his voice tight with suppressed emotion, though whether that emotion was concern or rage, only Madeline knew. "I'll make our apologies to the guests." As they climbed the stairs, Rivera's arms supportive around Madeline's waist, the doctor whispered, "Did you get it?" "Everything," Madeline breathed back, "but the security chief caught me. Edward suspects." Rivera's grip tightened fractionally. "Then we accelerate. Tonight." In the master bedroom, Rivera closed the door, immediately checking for listening devices with practiced efficiency. Finding none, she turned to Madeline. "What exactly did you find?" "Evidence of Claire's poisoning," Madeline said, her voice shaking as she removed the key from her palm where it had left an angry red imprint. "Medical reports, suspicious inquiries that were shut down, and the art fraud. It's all documented. I forwarded everything to your secure email." Rivera nodded, her face grim. "Good. That should be enough for—" The door opened without warning. Edward stood in the doorway, his tall figure backlit by the hallway lights, his expression unreadable. "How is my wife, Doctor?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. Rivera didn't miss a beat. "Just stress and dehydration, Mr. Pierce. Nothing to worry about, but she should rest for the remainder of the evening." Edward stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded like a gunshot. "I've canceled the rest of the gala," he said. "Our guests understand. A mother's health comes first, after all." He moved to the bed where Madeline lay, perching beside her with deliberate care. His hand came to rest on her belly, and she fought the instinct to recoil. "What really happened in the storage room, Madeline?" The question hung in the air, dangerous and loaded. Madeline met his gaze, forcing vulnerability into her expression. "I told you. I was upset after that woman threw cake at me. I needed somewhere quiet." "And the pain?" "It started suddenly. Stress, probably, like the doctor said." Edward's fingers flexed slightly against the prosthetic. "And how did you get into a locked room?" Madeline's heart stuttered. "It wasn't locked." "It's always locked," Edward said softly, his voice like silk over steel. "Marcus confirms the East Wing security every day." Dr. Rivera interjected, her tone professionally concerned. "Mr. Pierce, this questioning isn't good for your wife's condition. She needs calm and rest." Edward ignored her, his gaze never leaving Madeline's face. "What were you looking for?" "Nothing," Madeline whispered. "I just needed to get away." His hand moved from her belly to her throat, not squeezing, just resting against her pulse where Claire's necklace lay. "You know what I think?" he said conversationally. "I think you're not being honest with me. And in a marriage, honesty is everything." The irony of his words might have made Madeline laugh if fear wasn't closing her throat. She swallowed hard, feeling her pulse jump against his fingers. "Mr. Pierce," Rivera said sharply, "remove your hand from your wife immediately." Edward glanced at her as if surprised to find her still in the room. "Doctor, I believe your services are no longer required. My security team will see you out." "I'm not leaving my patient," Rivera stated firmly. "Oh, but you are." Edward's smile was terrifying in its pleasantness. "Unless you'd like me to call the medical board about your rather unusual practice. Falsifying pregnancy records would be grounds for losing your license, I believe." The blood drained from Rivera's face. He knew. Somehow, he knew. "Leave us," Edward repeated. Rivera looked at Madeline, silent communication passing between them. The detective's fingers brushed her jacket pocket, where Madeline knew she carried a gun. But with Edward's security undoubtedly waiting outside, immediate action would be suicide. "I'll check on you tomorrow, Mrs. Pierce," Rivera said pointedly. "First thing in the morning." After she left, silence filled the room like poisonous gas. Edward's hand remained at Madeline's throat, his thumb tracing lazy circles over her pulse point. "Now then," he said pleasantly, "let's begin again. What were you looking for in the storage room?" Madeline's mind raced. The evidence was sent. Rivera's team would move forward regardless of what happened now, but she needed to survive the night. "I was curious," she admitted, allowing a note of petulance to enter her voice. "You keep so many parts of the house locked away from me. It makes me feel like you don't trust me." Edward studied her, his head tilted slightly. "Trust is earned, my dear, and I'm beginning to wonder if I've been too generous with mine." His free hand moved to her belly again, pressing harder this time. Madeline tensed, terrified he would detect the prosthetic through the fabric of her dress. "This child means everything to me," Edward said, his voice soft but his eyes hard. "A son to carry on my name, my legacy." Claire understood that in the end. "What happened to Claire?" Madeline asked, unable to stop herself. Something flickered in Edward's eyes. An accident. A tragic accident. Was it? The words escaped before she could stop them, hanging in the air like a death sentence. Edward's hand tightened fractionally on her throat. "You've been in my files," he said flatly. "That's what you were doing in the storage room." Denial would be pointless now. Madeline met his gaze steadily. "Yes." To her surprise, Edward laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that chilled her more than his anger. "Oh, Madeline, I had such hopes for you, such plans." His smile faded. "But you've complicated things considerably." "Edward," she began, not sure what she meant to say, only knowing she needed to keep him talking until morning, when Rivera would return. "Shh." His finger pressed against her lips. "Don't make it worse with lies. I know exactly what you've done. The question is, what am I going to do about it?" He stood abruptly, moving to the bedroom window to look out at the departing guests, their headlights cutting through the darkness of the estate's winding driveway. "Did you know," he said conversationally, "that grief can cause all sorts of erratic behavior, especially in pregnant women? The hormones, the emotional distress. It's a volatile combination." Fear crawled up Madeline's spine. "What are you saying?" Edward turned back to her, his expression almost sorrowful. "After tonight's public humiliation, no one would be surprised if you suffered an emotional breakdown, especially when you lose the baby from the stress." "Edward?" "And a grieving, mentally unstable woman. Who would believe anything she said about her devoted husband, particularly if there's a history of psychiatric treatment?" Madeline's blood ran cold. "I don't have a psychiatric history." Edward smiled thinly. "Not yet, but Dr. Weiss, our family physician, has been quite concerned about your emotional state for some time. He's documented several concerning episodes." "That's a lie." "Is it?" Edward moved back to the bed, sitting closer this time, his weight pinning the edge of her dress. "Who do you think people will believe? The respected businessman who's already suffered one tragic loss, or the unbalanced woman making wild accusations to cover her own instability?" He was going to discredit her. Worse, he was going to institutionalize her, or kill her and make it look like suicide. The realization broke over Madeline like ice water. "You won't get away with it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "People know the truth." "What people?" Edward asked mildly. "Your fake doctor friend. By morning, she'll be facing an investigation that will destroy her career. No one else knows anything." "That's where you're wrong." Edward's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Madeline swallowed hard. She needed to buy time until morning, until Rivera could mobilize the evidence and return with proper authorities. "I sent copies of everything I found. To multiple people. If anything happens to me, it all comes out." It was a desperate bluff, but Edward hesitated, doubt crossing his features for the first time. You're lying." "Am I? How did I get into the storage room, Edward? Do you think I acted alone? That cake-throwing scene, do you really believe that was just a jealous mistress?" Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by cold fury. "The woman in red. She gave you the key." Madeline said nothing, letting her silence confirm his suspicion. Edward stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged predator. "It doesn't matter," he decided. "Whatever you think you found, it proves nothing. You have no real evidence against me." "I have Claire's medical records," Madeline countered. "The reports from doctors questioning her symptoms before each miscarriage. The timeline of her growing suspicions about your business dealings, right up until her death." Edward stopped pacing, his face hardening into a mask of controlled rage. "Claire was sick," he said flatly. "Mentally unstable, like you're becoming." "She was poisoned," Madeline stated, conviction giving her courage. "By you. Because she discovered your forgery operation. Because she threatened to expose you." He moved with shocking speed, grabbing her wrists and pinning her to the bed, his face inches from hers. "You know nothing," he hissed. "Nothing about Claire, nothing about me, nothing about what happens to people who threaten what's mine." Madeline felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat. "I know everything about Claire," she said, the words tasting like freedom even as danger pressed against her. "More than you ever bothered to learn." Confusion flickered across Edward's face. "What are you talking about?" With deliberate care, Madeline reached down to her dress, Edward's grip on her wrists having loosened in his confusion. She found the hidden fasteners of the prosthetic belly and released them, the expertly crafted fake pregnancy belly sliding free beneath her gown. Edward's eyes widened in shock. "What?" "Claire was my sister," Madeline said, the truth finally emerging after months of deception. "My half-sister. Different fathers, different last names. You never bothered to investigate her family properly. Too busy covering up her murder." Edward recoiled as if struck. "You're lying." "Claire and I weren't close growing up. The age gap, different fathers. But we reconnected as adults. We talked regularly. She told me about her fears, about your controlling behavior, about the accidents that kept happening." Madeline sat up straighter, strength flowing through her with each revealed truth. "When she died, I knew it wasn't an accident, but I needed proof." Understanding dawned in Edward's eyes, followed by a fury so cold it seemed to drop the temperature in the room. "You never loved me. This entire marriage was a deception," Madeline finished for him. "Just like your entire life, Edward. The difference is, my deception served justice. Yours served only greed." He moved so quickly she didn't have time to react, his hands closing around her throat where Claire's necklace lay. "You think you've won?" he snarled, his handsome face contorted with rage. "You think I'll let you destroy everything I've built?" Spots danced before Madeline's eyes as his grip tightened. This was how Claire had felt, she realized with distant horror. Helpless, betrayed, dying at the hands of the man who had promised to love her. "Let her go, Pierce." The new voice cut through the roaring in Madeline's ears. Edward's grip loosened just enough for her to turn her head and see Vanessa standing in the doorway, no longer in her red dress but in tactical gear, her service weapon aimed steadily at Edward's head. "Police," she said calmly. "Release her and put your hands where I can see them." Edward didn't move, his fingers still wrapped around Madeline's throat. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice eerily calm. "My wife is having a psychotic episode. Ask anyone who was at the gala tonight." "I was at the gala," Vanessa replied. "Detective Alexandra Rivera, Boston PD. And I've been investigating you for 2 years, ever since inconsistencies in Claire Pierce's death report crossed my desk." Edward's grip slackened further, and Madeline gasped for air, coughing as oxygen rushed back into her lungs. "You have nothing," Edward said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "We have everything," Rivera countered. "Financial records, forged provenance documents, evidence of witness tampering in Claire's death investigation, and now, attempted murder of your current wife, witnessed by a police officer." She gestured with her gun. "Move away from her, now." For one terrible moment, Madeline thought Edward would call the detective's bluff, would snap her neck before Rivera could fire. But self-preservation won out. He released her, raising his hands slowly. "This is absurd," he said, his composure returning with remarkable speed. "A misunderstanding. Madeline and I were having an argument, that's all." Rivera kept her weapon trained on him as uniformed officers appeared behind her. "Edward Pierce, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Madeline Pierce, for fraud, and pending further investigation for the murder of Claire Pierce." As they handcuffed him, Edward looked at Madeline with an expression of such hatred it made her recoil. "You'll regret this," he said softly. "No one crosses me and walks away." Madeline met his gaze steadily, one hand rubbing her bruised throat where Claire's necklace still lay. "Claire's finally crossing over," she replied, "and she's taking you down with her." 1 year later. The Foundation offices overlooked the harbor, sunlight dancing across the water as Madeline stood at the window, coffee cup warming her hands. Behind her, the walls were covered with framed news articles, most featuring the now infamous photograph of her in the emerald dress, cake sliding down the fabric, Edward's smirking face in the background. What had once been her moment of staged humiliation had become a symbol of the Claire Pierce Foundation's mission, to support victims of domestic abuse and fraud whistleblowers. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, turning to find Detective Rivera, Alex as she now called her, holding a thick manila folder. "The final reports," Alex said, placing the folder on Madeline's desk. "Edward's appeals were denied. He'll serve his full sentence. 20 years for Claire's murder, with additional time for fraud, evidence tampering, and the attempted murder of Madeline. Not enough, perhaps. Nothing could be enough for what he'd done to Claire, but justice nonetheless." "How are you feeling?" Alex asked, studying Madeline with the perceptive gaze that had first seen through Claire's drowning. Madeline considered the question, her hand unconsciously rising to her throat where Claire's necklace still hung. She'd kept it, reclaimed it from evidence, as a reminder, a talisman. "I'm healing," she said finally. "Some days are harder than others." The nightmares still came, dreams where she was Claire, water filling her lungs as Edward held her down, dreams where she was herself, Edward's hands around her throat, no Alex arriving to save her. But they were less frequent now, less vivid. "Doctor. Winters says grief isn't linear," Madeline continued, referring to the therapist who had helped her navigate the aftermath. "I didn't just lose Claire once. I lost her again when I stepped out of the role I'd been playing and had to face who I really am without the mission." For 2 years, every moment of her life had been dedicated to bringing Edward to justice. When it was over, when the performances and deceptions ended, Madeline had found herself adrift, unsure of her own identity. "You found your way," Alex observed, gesturing to the Foundation office around them. Madeline smiled faintly. "With help." So much help. From Alex, from the therapist, from the unlikely friendship she'd formed with Edward's other victims who had come forward after his arrest. The Foundation had given her purpose, a way to transform her pain and Claire's tragedy into something meaningful. "The exhibition opens tonight," Madeline said, changing the subject. "Will you come?" The exhibition had been her most healing project, completing the artworks Claire had begun before her death, pieces that subtly documented the control and fear she'd lived with. Paired with Madeline's own work from the past year, they formed a powerful narrative of sisterhood, loss, and reclamation. "Wouldn't miss it," Alex replied, her smile warming her usually serious face. The detective moved closer, her hand tentatively covering Madeline's. "You've done something remarkable here, you know. Claire would be proud. The simple statement hit Madeline with unexpected force, tears welling in her eyes. I hope so, she whispered. Sometimes I still feel like I failed her. You didn't, Alex said firmly. You risked everything to get her justice. That's not failure. That's extraordinary love. Madeline leaned into the detective's embrace, allowing herself the comfort of human connection that had been absent during her months of deception. What had begun as a professional relationship during the investigation had evolved over the past year into something deeper, more personal. Not romance, not yet, but the potential for it hummed between them, patient and unhurried. I should get ready for the opening, Madeline said finally, reluctantly pulling away. Alex nodded, understanding as always. I'll pick you up at 7. After she left, Madeline returned to the window, watching boats cut white paths through the harbor water. So much had changed, and yet there were days when she still felt like the woman in that emerald dress, cake sliding down the fabric, terror and determination warring within her. That evening, as visitors filled the gallery where Claire's and Madeline's artwork hung side by side, Madeline felt her sister's presence like a gentle hand on her shoulder. The final piece in the exhibition was the most personal, the prosthetic pregnancy belly encased in glass, transformed from an instrument of deception into a symbol of the future that had been stolen from Claire, now reclaimed through justice and the lives helped by the foundation. It's beautiful, Alex said, appearing at her side in a charcoal suit that complemented Madeline's simple black dress. All of it. Madeline slipped her hand into the detective's, drawing strength from the contact. Not beautiful, she corrected gently. Truthful. Later, as they walked along the harbor in the cool evening air, Madeline stopped to look out at the water. I'm thinking of selling the mansion, she said abruptly. It was never really mine, and I can't separate it from what happened there. Alex nodded. Fresh starts are good. I kept expecting to feel closure when Edward was sentenced, Madeline admitted. Some definitive end to the chapter. But grief doesn't work that way, does it? No, Alex agreed softly. It becomes part of you. The trick is not letting it become all of you. Madeline thought about the woman she'd been before Claire's death, the talented authenticator who saw truth in brushstrokes and pigments. She thought about the woman she'd become during her deception, single-minded, calculating, willing to sacrifice everything for justice. And she considered who she was becoming now, a woman learning to live without a mission, to exist for herself rather than for vengeance. I found this last week, she said, pulling a small photograph from her bag, Claire as a teenager, arm thrown around a younger Madeline, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. I don't even remember when it was taken. We wasted so much time apart. Alex studied the photo, her expression gentle. But you found each other in the end. Yes, Madeline whispered, tucking the photo away. We did. The night air carried the scent of salt and possibility as they continued their walk, two women with pasts marked by loss and pursuit of justice, moving forward together into an uncertain but hopeful future. Madeline's hand found Claire's necklace at her throat, the familiar weight a reminder of what had been lost and what had been gained. She had been carrying her sister's pain for so long, a different kind of pregnancy. Grief and love and guilt intertwined. Now, finally, she was learning to carry her own future, uncertain and fragile and precious. Behind them, city lights reflected on the harbor water, rippling and distorting like memories, like truth, like the lies we tell others and the ones we tell ourselves. Ahead, only the next step mattered, and the hand holding hers, steady and patient, ready for whatever came next. Sometimes the masks we wear to deceive others become the tools that reveal our deepest truths. Madeline's fake pregnancy, designed as a lie, ultimately delivered justice. The cake that once marked her humiliation became a symbol of her triumph, proving that our most painful moments can transform into our greatest strength. In Claire's memory, Madeline found not just justice, but herself, the most important discovery of all. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.